I was 20 years old, and I never had a boyfriend. I was a shy girl who grew up in a small town where dating options were limited, so I spent most of my time trying to find a significant other on online dating sites. I met a few people, but being paranoid about the whole meeting in real life thing prevented me from ever asking anyone out on a date. Then I met Mike. Mike seemed perfect. He was my age, and we shared the same interests, and we had the same sense of humor. Our conversations quickly moved from OkCupid chat rooms to texting, to actually talking on the phone. We did phone chats for about a month, through which I learned he was a medical student, he owned his own IT computer repair shop, and had his own apartment. At the end of the month, he finally convinced me to meet him in real life. For our first date, we arranged to meet for lunch in the food court of a mall, then go see a movie. I didn't tell my friends or family where I was going because I was embarrassed to admit I was going on an OkCupid date, so I tried to make our first date setting as public as possible. It ended up being one of the best dates of my life. We got so involved in our conversation that we missed the movie and ended up walking around inside the mall till it got dark. He wanted to head out to the parking lot to sit in his car and continue the discussion, but it was getting late and I had to go home, so I passed. I couldn't wait for our next date. I wanted a boyfriend so badly, and I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this way about a guy, so I eagerly agreed for his plans for our next date. We were going to meet at his apartment for dinner. I naively thought that, since I had already met him once, I didn't need to worry about telling anyone I'd be out with him that night. After what came next, I never made that mistake again. I was on my way to his place on the evening of our date when he texted me that he was working late at his computer repair shop and asked if I could come meet him there instead. The address he texted for his shop was about 2 hours away from the address he had given me for his apartment, but I was already on the road, and I was desperate to make this work, so I didn't mind. The first red flag went off when I arrived. His shop was a tiny one-room building, not far off from a shack. It was on a woodsy residential street outside of town and had no sign. Inside the shack, it was even worse. Computer parts were scattered all over the floor, nothing looked client-facing, and the carpet reeked of smoke and weed. He also didn't look like he was working at all. He was sitting with a group of older men who looked to be in their 40s, passing around a pipe. He introduced them as his friends. We hung out with them for about 20 minutes, during which none of them spoke to me or acknowledged me. After passing the pipe around a couple more times, Mike offered to drive me to his apartment. I told him I could drive myself, but he insisted he'd drive because he only had one parking spot. I reluctantly agreed, reminding myself that our first date went great, so I could trust him. At first, I couldn't even tell if it was his apartment. We had arrived in a small parking lot of a small hair salon called Salon True, closed for the night, which had plenty of empty parking spaces. He showed me to a door beneath the salon, which led to the basement of the building. Inside was a medium-sized cement room with nothing but an industrial sink, a pair of weighted dumbbells, a foam mat, and no windows. The only decoration he had was a bobblehead of a character from a show I had told him I had liked that looked brand new. I would have considered the idea that maybe he was struggling financially and had lied about everything because he was embarrassed about his financial situation, but then I saw the giant flat-screen TV and DV camera up against the wall. He closed the door behind us, and I watched helplessly as he closed the abnormal number of locks on it. He must have seen my fear because he quickly assured me that the reason he had so many locks was because the hairdressers upstairs hated him for no reason, and they had tried to enter his apartment on multiple occasions. At this point, every possible alarm was going off in my head. I was locked in a basement with no car, and no one knew where I was. I didn't even know where I was. But there was one thing I could still try. He walked across the room, his back toward me, and bent down to pick up one of his weighted dumbbells. While his back was turned, I pulled my iPhone slightly out of my pocket and booted up a game that was a song that sounded like a ringtone, then shoved it back in my pocket. When he turned back to look at me, the phone in my pocket appeared to be ringing. I answered the phone, pretending it was my dad, and faked that conversation like my life depended on it. My dad was mad at me for being out so late and demanded to know where I was. I told him the name of the salon and the name of the town we were in. I made it seem like he knew exactly where Salon True was. He told me to come home immediately or he would come get me. When I hung up, Mike was already unlocking the door. We got in his car and he drove back to the computer shop much faster than before. He dropped me off at my car, apologized, and said he would text me about our next date. I had never been more happy to be back in my own car. A few days later, He hadn't contacted me yet, so I tried calling him for an explanation. His service had been disconnected. Later that day, I told the story to my good friend Eric, and he tried to bring up Mike's OkCupid profile page, but that had been deleted too. However, I was lame, and when we were calling each other regularly, I had his OkCupid picture saved on my phone as his contact picture. I showed it to Eric, and he recognized Mike immediately. My friend Eric was a student employee at the IT department in his university who helped other students with computer issues. Eric said Mike would come in frequently to get viruses taken off his laptop, viruses that often looked like they were from really sketchy porn sites, and his name wasn't Mike. Eric was able to use info he had gathered about this guy from the IT department ticketing system to look him up on the school's database. Turns out he wasn't a med student at all. He was older than he said he was. He had dropped out of school this semester, and since he had to bring his laptop to another student to get it fixed, he clearly did not own an IT and computer repair business. I'm glad we never met again. This is my mom's story, not mine. This was back in the early 80s. My mom was a teenager at this point and was out at Dadedale Mall in Miami with my grandfather. They had went separate ways to go shopping and planned on meeting up at a certain location in the mall at a given time. While my mom was walking through the mall, an older guy approached her and kept telling her that she should model and come back to his place to do a photo shoot. This guy was really persistent and wouldn't leave my mom alone. She was a pretty young teenager who was naive, so she decided to follow him out to his car. As soon as she approached his car, she said she literally got the worst feeling in the world, and all the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She got closer to the car and immediately told him that this was a bad idea and decided to book it back to her dad. He started shouting cuss words at her and profanities, but she just kept running until she found her dad. She told him what had happened, and he told them all security, so she described the guy to them. The whole mall went on total lockdown, and a bunch of cops showed up. My mom thought she was in huge trouble for something that she did, until the cops had informed her that the man she described in the car description belonged to a man named Christopher Wilder, also known as the Beauty Queen Killer. This man was a nationwide serial killer who had raped 12 women and killed at least 8 of them through California, Texas, Oklahoma, Florida, and New Hampshire. They didn't capture this guy until 1984 when he had a shootout with the cops and apparently died on the scene. My mom was petrified to go anywhere alone for a very long time, and her dad became very overprotective of her. Now she's always watching those ID investigation channels, and an episode came on about him, and she always gets the chills. I'm glad she listened to her gut instinct and booked it, or who knows what this man could have done to her. I like to divide my life into 2 separate times, before Clark and after Clark. In 2012, I started working at a corrections facility in a small town close to where I lived. The job was actually very easy and I enjoyed my work there. At home though, things were a bit rocky. My husband and I were fighting a lot and had finally decided to separate. I was sad, but honestly I was more relieved, and it was causing me a lot of stress that I was venting about to this guy at work named Clark. I'll say that Clark is his last name, but we all went by our last names at this place. I wanted to mention this now so that there's no confusion later on in the story. Clark was a really good listener. He always heard what I had to say, never pressured me into talking about things that I didn't want to, offered well thought out insight when asked for, and just all around was a great friend. So it wasn't long before we started to develop feelings for each other and started seeing each other outside of work, intimately. Now before you ask, yes, I was still married, but my now ex-husband and I were no longer physically or romantically together, and Clark, to my knowledge, was single. Clark and I met up around 3 times outside of work, and every time we met up it was in a hotel, which I thought was odd since he lived alone that we couldn't have gone back to his place. He always had an excuse why we couldn't, and I never really pushed the issue. This should have been my first sign that something was off. Over the time of us seeing each other and talking, Clark had mentioned his crazy ex to me. He never told me her name, only that she was crazy and that they had been long engaged, but it didn't work out and they had never really talked anymore. It was nice that he was sharing his past with me, and I was in no place to judge him, so I would just listen to him vent like he had listened to me vent many times before. I felt as if we really connected. Little did I know who this man really was. It was the day after Christmas and I worked and Clark was off. We always called each other after work, so when I got to my car I turned on my phone and was a little shocked to see that I had 30 missed texts from Clark. He was drunk and basically saying that although he cared for me a lot, that we couldn't be together because he was still in love with his ex and that I deserved someone better than him. It was really confusing because we just had this friends with benefits thing going on, and it talked about how although it would be nice to date, neither one of us was in a place to be in a relationship. I tried to call him, but he never answered, so I went back home and went to sleep. The next day at work, I wasn't feeling well, so I asked to go home early and left 2 hours early, around 10 p.m. I called Clark when I got to my car, and he answered. We talked about what he said, and he apologized and said he still wanted to hang out if I wanted to, which I did. The strange thing was, he kept taking these other calls and clearly making up stories about who he was talking to over and over. I just overlooked it and said it wasn't any of my business. We got off the phone and I went home. The next morning when I woke up, I had a text from Clark that simply said, "Forget me." I instantly had this horrible feeling in my stomach that something was wrong. I tried to text him back, but I got no reply. When I got to work, he wasn't there like he was supposed to be. I was worried. When I clocked in, my supervisor asked to speak to me privately. He wanted to know if I knew where Clark lived or how to get a hold of his family. I told him I didn't as my heart sank. He said thanks and walked off. I felt sick. I ended up going back to my supervisor to tell him about the 30 text messages and how I was worried about him and if he could get someone to go to his house and check on him. My supervisor was really quiet and then told me that Clark had tried to kill himself last night and was in the hospital. I was shocked and heartbroken. I left work and went to go see him in the hospital. He looked rough. He had a big bandage on his wrist and a huge scratch mark across his face, which I thought was odd. I asked him why, and he said he couldn't tell me because if he did, I would be ashamed to have ever known him. I didn't know what he was talking about at all, but when I did leave, he asked me not to come back, not to call, and don't try to find him. It would be easier this way, he said. I was crushed. A couple days later, I was contacted by an investigator saying that he was investigating the death of a young woman named Cassandra Clark. As it turns out, before my friend, Ryan Clark, tried to commit suicide, he had killed his girlfriend by slitting her throat and stabbing her multiple times. This happened only a couple hours after we had gotten off the phone with each other that night. From what I was told, Clark was still seeing his girlfriend off and on and still staying at her place. This was because he was homeless and living out of his car, hence why we never went to his place. The night of the murder, Clark had confessed to seeing someone else, me, to her, and they ended up getting in a physical altercation in which he killed her. He's in jail now, serving 30 years for his crime. I can't begin to tell you how much this has affected my life and how much blame I have put on myself in the past for this. If any of Cassandra's family is reading this, I am so sorry for your loss. And for Clark, if there is a God, I hope he shows you no mercy. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please do me a huge favor and like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy my commentary. I get massive inspiration from the amazing talents such as Mr. Nightmare, Your Maker, Corpse Husband, and Lazy Masquerade. There's definitely some more, but these guys are definitely my favorites, and I would be completely ecstatic if one of my videos was viewed by one of those dudes. Anyway, thanks for watching. I love doing these videos, and I hope that people enjoy listening. Cheers, and